Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're tackling a massive, incredibly popular internet theory about the origins of the God of the Bible. We're going to act as a sort of historical courtroom today, drawing on a really fascinating deep dive by Mark Mountjoy, published by True Christian Press, to help us separate the actual history from the online hype.
So, if you spend any time in the digital marketplace of ideas today, you've probably seen this. You'll encounter content creators and even certain scholars pushing a pretty provocative claim. They argue that Yahweh was simply an adopted desert demon, or just a rebranded Canaanite weather god. But is that true? Well, we're going to put that to the test and see if the historical and ethical evidence actually backs that up.
Here is exactly how we'll break this down. Number 1. The storm god theory. 2. Two conflicting moral worlds. 3. The exclusive marriage covenant. 4. Exiled for ethical failures. And 5. The voice of conscience.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, the storm god theory, desert demon or divine reality.
We really have to start by acknowledging the scholarly landscape here and why this theory gains so much traction in the first place. It's super easy to see how modern culture blends the imagery of these ancient Near Eastern deities. The source text points out that modern scholarship definitely finds some parallels. Archaeological evidence suggests early worship of Yahweh originated south of Canaan, and early biblical literature sometimes describes him with characteristics that, on the surface, sound a lot like ancient storm gods.
Yes, there is some geographic overlap around places like Edom, Seir, and Teman. And yeah, they absolutely share storm imagery in those early texts, like God marching from deserts with heavenly hosts. But our source points out a profound twist here. This wasn't a sign of religious continuity. Actually, it was a rhetorical technique. Scholars call it particularistic apologetic rhetoric. Basically, the ancient Israelites were using the cultural language of the day as a flex to say, my God is greater than your God. It was about establishing dominance, not copying homework.
Moving on to Section 2. Two conflicting moral worlds, a stark juxtaposition.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that when we move past the poetry and look at the ethics, the similarities literally vanish. The source text argues that Yahweh introduced something completely unprecedented to the world, ethical monotheism. This was a total moral revolution. It meant that right and wrong weren't just relative to whichever local god you were trying to appease that afternoon. Instead, moral standards were established universally. And this brilliantly illustrates the divide. On one side, Yahweh commanded this unprecedented system of social justice. We're talking explicit care for widows, orphans, and foreigners, alongside strict demands for fair wages and debt forgiveness. But on the other side, Canaanite worship was a totally different reality. It centered around fertility cults, ritual prostitution, and sympathetic magic. The source even notes that Canaanite mythology depicted their gods engaging in incest. It was a completely different moral universe.
But the most tragic and honestly horrific contrast outlined in our text was their attitude toward children. Molech worship, which was a Canaanite practice, literally involved infants being sacrificed and burned alive in bronze statues, while drums were beaten to drown out their cries. Biblical law, conversely, promised the absolute death penalty for anyone who harmed children in this way, and explicitly forbade Molech worship. This proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that these two religious systems were fundamentally morally opposed.
Which brings us to Section 3, the exclusive marriage covenant. Who was Yahweh married to?
This is a crucial point that really just destroys the storm god thesis entirely. Think about it. If Yahweh was just a rebranded Baal, he would logically be married to a goddess, right? Like Asherah. But that's not what we find at all. The Mosaic law actually functions as an exclusive marriage contract, but not with a goddess. It's a marriage with a human population, Israel. Yahweh demands absolute fidelity from the people, whereas Canaanite mythology features deities just married to each other, engaging in all sorts of chaotic divine drama.
The biblical prophets constantly used marital infidelity as the ultimate metaphor for Israel's sin. When the people worshipped other gods, it wasn't just some technical protocol error, it was spiritual adultery. This highlights a deeply relational, intensely personal ethical framework that simply did not exist in ancient storm deity worship.
Let's look at Section 4, Exiled for Ethical Failures, the Logic of Judgment.
So history records the massive exiles of Israel in 722 BC and Judah in 586 BC. The biblical record states unequivocally that these entire populations were deported to Assyria and Babylon. But why? Well, the texts don't say they failed to perform a rain dance properly. No, they were exiled for stubborn moral disobedience, idolatry, breaking that marriage covenant we just talked about, and severe social injustice, like oppressing the poor.
And this brings us to a massive logical hurdle for the rebranded deity theory. Why in the world would a weather god care about social justice? It makes absolutely zero logical sense for a fertility deity who only cares about seasonal sacrifices and agricultural yields to exile a whole nation for failing to care for the poor. It just doesn't add up.
All right, Section 5, The Voice of Conscience, a Modern Testimony.
To bring this massive ethical chasm into a practical modern light, the author shares a deeply personal story. He recounts an event from 1987 where, while driving to work, he claims to have heard a commanding, audible voice in his car directing him to an empty post office.
Following the precise directions of this voice, literally telling him, "Turn to your right, look straight ahead," he walked into the post office and found a blank, unclaimed money order for $425 sitting right there on the counter.
Now, his friends urged him to cash it, naturally calling it a sudden blessing or provision, but the author states he felt the Holy Spirit warn him clearly, "If you cash it, I will certainly punish you." He realized this money likely belonged to someone really desperate, maybe someone who had begged for help with rent. Out of reverence for God's authority and honestly fear of the consequences, he voided the money order and returned it. Instead of just handing him a lucky payday, God used this intense situation to test his character.
You see, a storm god or fertility deity would just let you keep the cash. That's blind material blessing. But the God of Israel spoke to the author's conscience. It was entirely about testing moral character, enforcing universal right and wrong, and showing mercy for the vulnerable, unseen person who lost the money. It demonstrates a paternal care for righteousness that completely transcends our own personal convenience.
As published by True Christian Press, this essay demonstrates that the evidence against the whole YouTube rebranded deity claim is pretty overwhelming. When you actually dig into it, the fundamental characters of these deities are at total odds with one another.
So the ultimate takeaway is this. Ethical monotheism wasn't just a slow evolution from ancient Canaanite beliefs. It was a complete revolution. The transformation from societies that literally practiced child sacrifice to a culture rooted in individual dignity, social justice, and strict moral accountability was a radical, absolute break from ancient Near Eastern religions.
And that brings us to the end of our analysis. This explainer leaves us with a profound reality to ponder. If this universally binding moral law wasn't just an evolution of ancient weather myths, but a genuine historical revolution, what does that mean for our standard of justice right now? We are left to consider if we are all still accountable to the God who speaks to the human conscience today. Think about that as you process this information. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking great questions.